From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South. I'm Camila Escalante. Venezuela's government has denounced the forced and illegal occupation of some of its diplomatic properties in the United States. Foreign Minister Jorge Ariaza said that this is a clear violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. U.S. authorities must correct this irregular situation immediately. This was a response to representatives of opposition lawmaker Juan Guaido illegally forcing their way into 3 of the country's diplomatic properties. Guaido's envoy says that his cohorts occupied 2 buildings in Washington and 1 in New York. And the People's Forum, an incubator for social movements in New York, immediately responded, issuing a call out for protests against U.S. intervention. The People's Forum says that this is another aggression in the long list of attacks against the Bolivarian Revolution. And this was reportedly New York City police escorting out the group aligned with the Venezuelan opposition as they were booed by social movement activists. The opposition had plans to celebrate, but protesters blocked the entrance so that no one else could enter. And here's what those demonstrators had to say about why the rapid response was so important.
Banks using their power financially to take the money from Venezuela and literally directly take food out of Venezuelan mouths and take supplies and necessary materials out of from the people's hands, right? And let's talk about how the Maduro government, everything they've been able to do for the people, everything the Bolivarian Revolution has been able to do for the people. $7 billion are being stolen from the Venezuelan people by the U.S. government every year. They're strangling the Venezuelan economy just like they did in Chile in 1973 and just like they've done throughout history. Let us find out the truth.
Just last week, a North American delegation visited Venezuela. The visit was organized by the U.S. Peace Council and the Committee for International Solidarity in Venezuela. The delegation met with community groups, political parties, and members of the government, including a private meeting with President Maduro.
We're with our friends of the World Peace Council. They've come from the United States, and we're very grateful for their presence. We've spoken for more than an hour and a half with all of their expressions of solidarity to say no to the war against Venezuela, no to sanctions against Venezuela.
One of the members of the delegation was Ajamu Baraka, the national organizer for Black Alliance for Peace.
We are here in Venezuela to demonstrate that there are vast numbers of people in the U.S. who are in opposition to the gangsterism of this current administration. We want the people of this country to know that we stand with you. We understand the importance of Venezuela. We understand that Venezuela's leadership is vital not only for all of Latin America and the Caribbean, but in fact to the world. So we say to the Venezuelan people, stand strong, understand what you represent, understand the importance of this project for all of us. So we're here to remind you of that we are with you. We're here to say to you that our solidarity goes beyond just having meetings. We're prepared to struggle to the end to protect this project.
Moving on to Haiti now, where the lower house has voted to remove the Prime Minister, Jean-Henri Séant. This comes just 6 months after Séant took office in the midst of a persistent economic and political crisis. 93 members of parliament voted in favor of the motion to sack Séant, while 6 voted against and 3 abstained. The Prime Minister did not attend the vote. He had expected to face a vote of no confidence in the Senate, but they did not reach quorum. Our correspondent, Kendi Zador in Port-au-Prince, can tell us more.
The Chamber of Deputies voted to remove the Prime Minister Jean-Henri Séan during a special session with 93 of 117 deputies voting to remove the Prime Minister. But the session took place in his absence, because both chambers demanded his presence on the same day. There appears to be a conflict between the two chambers after the vote against the Prime Minister took place. He was in the Senate to argue against the decision to remove him from office. According to the PM, the session was invalid because he can't be in the two chambers simultaneously. The Senate was unable to finish its session because there are only 10 senators present, and normally the body functions with a minimum of 16 senators present. The parliamentary conflict goes on because the President of the Senate said the session will continue next Wednesday. That means the Senate continues to recognize the authority of Jean-Henri Séan, despite the vote to dismiss him in the Chamber of Deputies. The vote to remove the Prime Minister 6 months after his ratification was expected, because he had been in conflict with the President, Jovenel Moïse. The President isn't satisfied with his work, especially with regard to a national dialogue. There are also people with the President who believe that the Prime Minister is looking to replace him. It's important to note that the majority of deputies and senators side with the President. It's impossible to say what's going to happen now, because the situation is completely new here.
That was Kendi Isidore in Port-au-Prince. Moving on, the president of Mozambique fears that the death toll from Cyclone Idai could exceed 1,000 victims. South Africa has announced it is sending troops to help with recovery efforts. The tropical storm has damaged 90% of the southern city, the second most populated city. Rescuers evacuated people from a port city devastated by the cyclone. A dam burst on Sunday, cutting off the last road remaining to the city of about 500,000 people. According to the Red Cross and the Red Crescent Federation, at least 180 people died in Mozambique, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and South Africa. Meanwhile, rescue workers have started a search for survivors of the devastating cyclone. The official death toll in Mozambique still stands at 84, but according to authorities, more than 100,000 people are still in danger.
Flying sheets of metal, decapitated people. Some people are in hospital. It's really bad. No one is rescuing us here. We don't eat properly, we don't sleep properly, we have no home.
The biggest threat we have now, even bigger than the cyclone, is floods, because it's raining more and more, and the hydrographical basins are increasing their level. And here we are in the lower part of the province, which means all the water comes this side.
And a group of Zimbabwean school children have been rescued after being stranded for 2 days in the aftermath of the Cyclone Idai. Following the heavy storms, roads and bridges were destroyed, leaving school children stranded and trapped by floods. Searches and rescue operations are still ongoing. Our correspondent, Matuba Matlahe, has the latest.
Mozambican President Filipe Nyusi says the death toll from Cyclone Idai could be as high as 1,000. He spoke on state radio on Monday afternoon after he flew by the helicopter over the Indian Ocean port city of Beira and the rural Manica and Sofala provinces, where he reported widespread devastation. Now, at the same time, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa says he has deployed the South African National Defence Force to Mozambique to assist with recovery efforts. Cyclone Idai's trail of destruction has also affected South Africa in a big way. It has caused severe damage, knocking down pylons and affecting power supply here in South Africa, which has had major repercussions. And those power outages have had serious economic losses for many businesses here in the country, as they cannot operate without power. But at this stage, all eyes are on the death toll that's expected to rise sharply as recovery efforts continue in Mozambique. It's back to you, studio.
Thank you, Matuba, for that report. The death toll for floods in Indonesia has risen to 79 people. More than 4,000 have been displaced, and dozens others are injured and still missing. The disaster was triggered by torrential rain and landslides and has mostly affected the easternmost province of Papua. The evacuation process is still taking place, with affected areas that haven't been reached yet. Those displaced are being sheltered in 6 evacuation centers. Now to Colombia. Indigenous community-led protests have blocked a major highway in the southwest of the country after a week of protests against the government of Iván Duque. Protesters are demanding a meeting with the president, saying that the government breached agreements made regarding their lands. They're demanding respect for human rights and reject violence against their communities, especially against community leaders. Police have engaged in repressive tactics, even burning a camp over the weekend.
It is worrying that the national government does not show a gesture of willingness to meet with farmers, and we are concerned about the fact that there might be a stronger confrontation than what we have had these past few days.
And demonstrators in the Colombian capital of Bogotá expressed their support for the indigenous and Afro-descendant communities mobilizing in the southwest of the country. They demanded that President Iván Duque engage in constructive conversations with social organizations striking in Cauca province. We'll take a short break now. Join us in a few.
The life is full of moments. Moments of fight. Moments of hope. Moments that transcend. Moments that you can live in. Telesur documentaries. Sundays. Only on Telesur.
Welcome back. U.S. sanctions imposed on Venezuela are also hurting Guyana's economy and the island's financial relations with its South American neighbor. Guyana currently owes Venezuela roughly $115 million under the Petro-Caribe deal. However, the government has not been able to make cash payments to Venezuela given the U.S. imposed financial restrictions. Guyana's finance minister says repayments are being held in a special account until the sanctions are lifted. The Caribbean Development Bank is projecting a 3% growth rate for Antigua and Barbuda's economy this year. This is due to increase in tourism and construction activity. The Caribbean Tourism Organization says stayover arrivals grew by just over 9% last year. Similarly, cruise ship passenger arrivals increased by just over 13%. Journalist Gabriel Hernandez has been killed in the south of Honduras. Our correspondent Hilda Silvestrucci brings us the details.
A journalist from the south of the country, Gabriel Hernandez, was killed this Sunday. The motive for this murder is yet to be clarified, but he had already reported some threats. He was doing some journalistic investigations related to corruption in the council hall of municipality of Valle, the city where he was murdered. Hernandez used to point out the corruption of these authorities as well as from some lawmakers in the area. Over 70 journalists have been killed since 2001, with an impunity rate that reaches 92%. So far, authorities have not given any detail or explanation. Only the National Commission for Human Rights has urged the authorities to investigate the murder of Gabriel Hernandez.
In Argentina, President Mauricio Macri's government is seeking the removal of a judge who's investigating an illegal espionage web that involves politicians, lawyers, and journalists. Our correspondent from Buenos Aires, Edgardo Esteban, has the details.
The government of Mauricio Macri, through the Minister of Justice, Germán Garabano, has presented to the Judicial Council a complaint calling for the removal of Judge Alejo Ramos Padilla. This is after they tried to stop the judge's investigation into an ideological, judicial and political espionage web, involving former officers and businessmen, who are all involved in the Notebooks investigation, in which the former president, Cristina Fernández, is also implicated, as are many others. And the judge Ramos Padilla is now investigating the Attorney General, Carlos Stornelli, who is part of that famous case. The judges, congressmen, businessmen, and even intelligence services involved in the investigation are all close to the president. So from this perspective, you can understand the current government's major efforts to bury and stop the investigation. But it's going to be difficult for Macri to move his complaint forward, due to a lack of support from the 9 members of the Judicial Council.
And meanwhile, demonstrators and artists from the social movement Patria Grande held a performance in front of Federal Justice Court in Buenos Aires under the slogan, Comodoro Pig, the pig pen of democracy. The demonstrators denounced the complicity between judicial and political power and the persecution of opposition leaders by intelligence agents, the media, and officers. Former Uruguayan President Julio Maria Sanguinetti is running for president once again. He says he plans to make security and unemployment the focus of his campaign. 83-year-old Sanguinetti says Uruguay also needs to modernize education and reform Mercosur. The former president also pointed out the situation in Venezuela will likely dominate the presidential campaign in the country. He said the government and the opposition must start a dialogue.
For the people, the biggest worry is security, because it is what has unsettled daily life in a country that is traditionally tranquil, with a calm lifestyle. On a wider perspective, today, unemployment is also becoming a worry.
Peruvian Popular Force Party leader Keiko Fujimori has not testified before the public prosecutor. Our correspondent in Lima, Jaime Herrera, has the details.
Keiko Fujimori, the leader of Popular Force and former presidential candidate, decided today to stay silent and not answer any questions the public prosecutor asked in the investigation of alleged asset laundering. Later on social media, she said she hasn't answered anything, arguing that the attorney in charge of the interrogation, José Domínguez Pérez, has lost objectivity. He was the person who asked for her pre-trial detention that currently has her behind bars in the Chorrillo prison in Lima City. That's why she asked for the right to remain silent at the hearing. The public prosecutor is investigating Keiko Fujimori because they suspect her of leading a criminal web of asset laundering. And they say that during the 2011 presidential race, she received $1,200,000 for financing her electoral campaign. However, this resource that came from Odebrecht, the Brazilian company, wouldn't have come to Peru in a regular way, rather through people who hide these assets and get them as income from other activities that the party organized. It's important to mention that after she refused to answer questions during the hearing, many members of the party attacked the attorney José Domínguez Pérez whilst he was leaving prison. They threw objects at him. One of them reached out and harmed him, and now he is in a delicate condition.
The Colombian city of Medellin has held a gay Miss Universe beauty pageant where transgender people and drag queens competed. Contestants could represent a country of their choice for the event, which aimed to send a message of inclusion to society. The winners received money and opportunities to participate in international competitions. We'll take a short break now. Stay with us.
The Pakistani journalist Tariq Ali examines the mass media influence promoted by imperialism. Get access to the analysis of the socio-economic and political life of the whole South America on our screen and platform in English. A critical place committed to the truth to determine the major events that transformed the world today. On Monday, only on Venezuela.
Welcome back. Officials say the black boxes from the crashed Ethiopian Airlines show similarities to the Lion Air crash. According to Ethiopian Minister of Transport, at least one similarity is the length of time the planes were in the air before crashing. In October, all 189 people on board Lion Air Flight 610 were killed when the flight went down over the Java Sea in Indonesia 13 minutes after takeoff.
It's been already indicated that there are similarities. Particular similarities will be explained and more details will come out at each stage. But there are indications that there are clear similarities, especially with the number of minutes they spent after takeoff. But with the news revelations, it is better to pose questions to relevant authorities, as I'm doing right now here.
The World Food Program has stopped distributing food after 3 people died and 200 others became sick. The Uganda International Red Cross and Red Crescent says cases of people with suspected food poisoning were reported Saturday at a health center in Napak, a day after food distribution to the families. The World Food Program and government of Uganda are still investigating the case. People have been warned not to eat distributed food. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa got a taste of the daily frustrations of the working-class commuters after the train he boarded on Monday was delayed by over 2 hours. Ramaphosa says the delay was unacceptable. The country's cities continue to be divided along race and class lines, with poor, predominantly black citizens living on the urban periphery, far from city-based workplaces. Getting to work can be expensive and time-consuming. Uganda's members of parliament from the ruling party has endorsed 74-year-old President Yoweri Museveni to run for the 2021 presidential election. A victory at the next election would extend his rule for 40 years. The government removed the 2-term presidential limit in 2005 and 2018, scrapped the age limit of 75. The European Union chief diplomat, Federica Mogherini, has held a meeting with China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi. During the meeting, Wang Yi reiterated the country's call for a mutually beneficial relationship between his country and the European Union. He also condemned what he called the United States' abnormal and immoral attempts to bring down Chinese companies by using what he calls baseless accusations. Meanwhile, energy experts are warning that the United States shale oil production could jeopardize plans by OPEC to stabilize oil prices. The International Energy Agency forecasts that the United States will account for 70% of oil production in the next few years. It added that such a scenario would make it hard for OPEC to influence the price of oil.
At this moment in time, there is certainly a need for both shale and everybody else's oil barrels. Whether there will be a need in 5 years' time, the fight gets tighter, if peak demand happens, that's a big question. I suspect it will, and I suspect OPEC will not be able to hold on to the maximize price over market share strategy as they have done for the last 50 years.
Far-right Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro visited the CIA during his first official trip to Washington. Bolsonaro is on a 3-day visit to the United States. The Brazilian president will meet his counterpart Donald Trump at the White House on Tuesday. The meeting was organized after the 2 right-wing leaders expressed mutual admiration for each other. Sudan and South Sudan have agreed to demilitarize the disputed common borders between the 2 countries within 1 month. The 2 countries say they're going to implement various recommendations of a deal for forming a demilitarized buffer zone between them. Sudan and South Sudan have disputed the border and traded accusations of rebel support since the separation of South Sudan from Sudan in 2011. Israeli authorities have demolished 2 Palestinian-owned buildings in northern Israel. According to witnesses, heavily armed Israeli forces raided the area with several bulldozers and began razing Palestinian-owned structures in the area. Residents said the buildings were demolished under the pretext that they were built without permits. Nearly all Palestinian applications for building permits are denied by the Israeli authorities, forcing communities to build illegally. A comic exhibition in Lebanon's capital, Beirut, is highlighting the experiences of refugees. The In Transit exhibition has 350 artworks by 37 artists from 12 countries, including Syria, Germany, and Egypt. The illustrations are aimed at showing the problems migrants and refugees face. The illustrations are being shown at the Museum and Urban Cultural Center until March 24th.
It is kind of an artistic medium that can express stories and important serious subjects that the country is dealing with, or that are happening in the whole region, in a way that is different from how we usually receive information, through television, the news, and even photography. These illustrations are done in a narrative way, visually and through the text.
We've come to the end of this newscast. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telestarenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telestar English, I'm Camila Escante. Thanks for watching.